I had one question about your last work that you put on for the developers and the associations with them with a security focus. Do you think that the assumption of everyone assuming the developers should securely develop everything is too much responsibility for one position?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree. And this was also the problem, basically, as I mentioned, everyone was assuming that developers, they know what they're doing, they will take care of it, but developers say, okay, we don't know how, we don't have the time. So ideally, yes, everyone should play a part. There should be measures implemented that make the developers' life easy. I mentioned education, but also there is a number of tools, such as the automated tools for automated security checks. Of course, they will not solve all security issues. You still have to do some manual work to take care about security, but at least you can alleviate some of the burden from the developers by properly integrating these tools into the security lifecycle. So this is something that can kind of make life for the developers easier. But yes, in general, it is about security culture. It is about management, providing developers with resources. It is about security experts, data protection officers, information security officers who are there, who are open to communication. So the communication channels are also clear. So if we have a situation where the developer wants to implement some feature, but they don't know, for example, whether it is safe to collect this kind of data from the customers, or if they do collect this data, what is the best way to store this data? Ideally, in the company, there would be clear communication channels, for example, to the data protection officer, which can then consult the developer what they should or should not do with the data. So yes, this was also the point that we should not just rely on developers. We should really take care about the security culture in the whole company.
Did this answer your question?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Anybody else? Yes, Leah.
Oksana, thank you so much for your amazing talks. So I have one question for the first talk that you gave. I'd actually be interested in your thoughts on whether or not cookie banners can be rescued or fixed eventually, and if so, if we should do that actually, because they in the end put again the burden on the users, and maybe we can have better solutions to consent on the web in general.
Essentially, I agree. I don't know whether they can be rescued. I know that there are some efforts underway. So several countries, including Denmark, including Germany, I'm thinking maybe some other European countries, they actually have passed legislations that forbid the use of dark patterns. At the very least, they or not legislation, sometimes the guidelines, non-binding guidelines, but at least it is strongly advised to not to use dark patterns, to really make sure that the reject button is there. It is very noticeable and it can be clicked. So at least if you want to keep with these diamonds, then this is the least you can do to really make sure that reject button is easy to find and easy to click. But ideally, I agree with you that it is still places the responsibility on the user, and maybe an ideal way to be would be, I don't know, not collect data you don't need. Collect only data you need for providing the service, and the rest just don't do it.
Yeah, okay.
So it is a radical solution, but maybe there are less radical ones. But essentially, I agree with you that placing responsibility on the user is essentially shifting the responsibility from the companies who should be the ones bearing the responsibility.
Yeah, thank you so much, because it's actually not so easy to answer, in my opinion, also, because in the end you need the user in a way, because you cannot the consent needs to be given by the person who uses the product in a way, right? So it's a little bit of a trade-off maybe. So yeah, thank you so much for your thoughts on that.
Great. I have another question to Habiba and Mohamed. So regarding with this contact tracing app, why did you choose to investigate France and Australia, and were there any differences between the samples?
There were no differences found between the concerns of the users from the both countries. We actually selected the two countries to just investigate how how the situation is around two geographically distant countries. But we found no significant differences among the concerns of the users.
Interesting. And what do you think is the most promising way to increase the adoption rate of CTAs?
So the more transparent data collection you do is there, the more trust they are going to have in it. So like we said in the paper, that the consent in data collection is one of the meanings of privacy for the users. So if there is consent in data collection and the user knows how the data is going to be used and processed even after the pandemic as well, so that establishes a level of trust between you and the user.
So would you recommend making CTAs mandatory?
So according to the paper's results, we should not make them mandatory. We should have like voluntary, because if we make it mandatory, the users are most likely to adopt to other ways to avoid using it. For example, some of the participants mentioned that they will turn off the Bluetooth or their phone actually to just avoid using it. Some of them even mentioned that they will leave their smartphones behind at their home when they go out to some other place.
Great, thank you. Any more comments or questions to Habiba or Mohamed, maybe? Great, then I have also some positive reactions for the paper So I Sold My Soul. Awesome job with the study of deliberately avoiding priming the users to think anything about cookies or computer security. And we have also another question for this paper. Could you tell us more about how dark patterns in cookies differ from dark patterns in other contexts? Do you think there are things we can learn from dark patterns in context other than cookies that would be applicable to dark patterns in cookies, or the other way around? Oksana.
Yes, so this is an interesting question, and it is indeed something that we have been considering, and that also other researchers and practitioners who are working on this topic are considering. So indeed, there is a similarities between dark patterns in cookies and dark patterns, say, on websites that try to sell you something that you don't necessarily want to buy. And indeed, there are some similarities, so you can apply the insights from the studies in one domain to the other. One difference I would see is that with cookies, the disadvantage of the users is not quite so immediate. So, for example, let's take a website that tricks you into, I don't know, signing a contract with some service you don't really need. In this case, you immediately see that, okay, something is wrong because now I have to pay money for something I didn't want to buy in the first place. So here, the harm of being tricked, so to say, with the dark patterns is quantifiable, it's noticeable, and this is different with regards to cookie disclaimers, because also when we talked about privacy harms in this study, but also in the other studies we did, it is not quite easy for people to be specific about privacy harms. It was more about, I don't like it, I feel uneasy, it just feels wrong that my data is everywhere and who knows what's happened with this. So it was not so much about concrete harm where you can say, okay, here I was tricked by this advertisement and now I had to pay, I don't know, 100 euros for this stuff I don't need. Here it's more about, it's more this psychological self-anxiety of uneasiness on the one hand, and on the other hand, if indeed there are some harms coming from this data, for example, this data being leaked somewhere else at some point and then will be used for some nefarious means, or maybe it is used to profile the users and do some kind of shady stuff with that. In this case, this harm is not quite so easily connected to the act of sharing data with cookies. So the thing I'm coming to is that, yes, there are similarities about dark patterns in other services and in cookies, but in cookies it's more difficult to reason about it because you cannot really tell people, or you cannot tell legislators that if people are tricked to do this, then this kind of harm is caused to them. It's very harder to quantify, to define. So there are these differences, but yes, there are similarities, and one can learn from these domains.
Thank you. Happy to hear your thoughts on this. I have also another question to all of you three, which is maybe relevant here because of the privacy session context. So after all, do you think the GDPR failed? I'm happy to hear all the opinions, and let's start with Mohamed maybe.
Well, in my opinion, I think it has improved things and it's a step in the right direction. I think after, seeing it for some time and observing, what has changed, I think there are still some things that need to be improved. So I think it's a continuous process, to keep improving it, especially with, how technologies are changing very quickly. There are lots of things that are not yet covered, and I think it's a step in the right direction, but it's still not enough. So we still need to do more work to improve it.
Habiba?
Yes, I would like to second the opinion by Mohamed that everything, because we are like advancing in technologies, things are changing. So everything needs to be made more improved with time. So there's like things are improving, but let's hope for the best.
Thank you. And Oksana?
I agree with what has been said. I definitely don't think GDPR has failed. It's not perfect, of course, and also in my talks I gave one specific example where the measure proposed by GDPR does not work, and I also spoke about challenges people have in implementing GDPR. But still, on the same side, it did make people, make companies to think about what data they collect and how they use it. So it is not possible, or it is not so easy just to collect whatever data they can, just in case they need it someplace later, and then just let it sit there or whatsoever. It is definitely helpful to make people understand, also people and companies, that yes, data protection is important, and not just limiting collection of the data, but also thinking about why you need this data and for what purpose you collect this data, for what purpose you use it. So I think the GDPR has been helpful in bringing focus on that, but of course it's not perfect, and of course it's subject to improvement and to change, especially given the technologies change. I'm happy to see it being more enforced, especially on larger companies. So there are actually consequences of violating GDPR. So I think it's a step in the right direction, definitely.
Great. I have also a follow-up question for you, Oksana. How can companies be motivated to omit the use of dark patterns?
I mean, this is the thing, right? Because from the business perspective, they need to have data, or they want to have data. So one way to do this is, again, speak about stricter regulations so that it simply will not be legal to have dark patterns. But another thing is that something that also came up from the study, and this also surprised me, because I was not surprised to see negative attitudes towards data collection. What I was surprised to see is, again, how our participants spoke about it. So I mentioned it in the talk that people used words such as disgusting, creepy. They swore a lot, which, they did swear a lot. So as a company, you have to think that if you do use dark patterns, essentially, yes, you might trick people into clicking on these dark patterns, but do you really want people to think about you in this way? Do you really want people to associate your product with some creepy, disgusting, manipulative ads? So even in absence of regulations, it's also about trust of your customers. And do you want to keep trust of your customers? So to me, it's also a reason not to use dark patterns.
Thank you. Any comments on that or other questions? Also, if online audience will have some questions, please just post them in Slack. So Habiba and Mohamed, we have, I think, one question.
My name is Barry Liba. Mohamed, in GDPR needs to be improved. Are you considering improved in the legislature but with amendments, or are you talking about going through the courts and getting interpretations and applicability to different situations?
I think both. So, one thing we've been working in recently is privacy, like the implications of the sensors that you find in XR headsets, like AR glasses and VR headsets. And I think, a lot of the sensors there, they help you, like you can use them, you need them to actually, find where the user is, find if there are obstacles around them, if people are approaching them. But then the access, like if an AR app, for example, has access to this data, there are a lot of things that could be done with the data, including things like inferring sensitive information about people around the user, so not just only the user but people around them. So these are things that it's very difficult to understand how GDPR impacts them. And I think the answer would be we need to do both. We need to better understand how we can interpret GDPR in the context of these technologies, and we need to also probably we need to amend. I'm not a law expert, but I think we need to also cover things that we're not really wouldn't be covered by the existing regulation.
Great, thank you. And I have also a follow-up question specifically to your paper. Do you know why participants rated the app to reduce their chances of getting infected rather low?
And so do you mean that participants say that the application would reduce their chances of getting infected, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yes, so the participants said so because the application provided early notification of if they have been in close contact with an infected person. So that actually is, and so the early notification helps them to early self-isolate. So if they do that, it actually reduces the number of users that would have been infected if they were not notified on time.
Great.
Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you. So do we have any other questions? Oh, I think we have one on Slack. So we have a further question for Oksana. Are there dark patterns that you would recommend that are less or appear less malicious in intent?
Right, so I'm not sure about that I understand this question. I'll try to answer it and then feel free to correct me. So if you're asking about what kind of patterns I would recommend to use in cookie banners, it means that basically, as I mentioned before, the option to reject cookies or to reject all but necessary cookies is something that should be there. So something that people should be able to see whenever they first see that notice, and that should be able to click. So ideally, you would have two kind of buttons. They are close to each other. They are the same in look and feel. One says accept, another says reject. So this would be a simple way to do this. Of course, a more simple way would be not to collect any data aside from what you really need to make the service function, but this is something I touched on before. Does this answer your question, or did you mean something else?
If we need more information on that, please just provide more information on Slack if somebody will ask for details. And I would also like to ask a follow-up question here with regards to the Danish company study, which was pretty interesting, I think. So could you please explain why security awareness training is more popular within large than small companies?
Right, so my impression of this, and also not just from this study, but from other studies we did, is that when you talk to people with small companies, they often don't think about security at all. So if you think about what it is, it might be some startup, it might be some kind of small business. They don't think of themselves as being a target of cybersecurity attacks. So they believe that, okay, we're too small, we're too insignificant, no one is going to target us. So the reason why there is no security awareness is because first they don't see the need, they don't think about security, they don't have time or again resources to think about security. And also there is a question of costs, because especially for small companies, it is a problem that they don't have the budget to spend for security trainings, especially if you have to invite outside consultants and so on. So for these reasons, they just don't do any. So my assumption would be this is the reason.
That's pretty interesting, considering also the developer and manager dynamic or conflict. What do you think, who feels responsible for security? The manager or the developer?
Well, essentially no one, as it appears, because the manager just believes that the developers will handle everything, and the developers maybe they do feel responsible, or some of them do feel responsible, but essentially it's something like they don't have time, maybe someone else will take care of it.
We have also, thank you, we have also a follow-up question here in person.
Yeah, it's just a comment, common question. I'm from SAP, big company. For security vulnerability, a static analyzer, I can run them and I can discover something like as a developer, as a manager, whatever. What do I have for privacy? I mean, somehow the comment question is a bit what we as community are providing to this industry in order to help them towards GDPR.
So this is a good question, and I know that there are tools that have been proposed by the academia that investigate the flow of data, there are some kind of analysis that are possible to be done, which data is being transferred, which data is being collected, are there any policies on deleting this kind of data, and so on. So on the top of my head, I cannot really name any specific tools, but there are tools that exist. And there are also tools that check for the GDPR compliance in a sense that you run it, and if it finds some violations, for example, if it finds some piece of data that actually had to be deleted, but that's still somewhere there, or if they find some data flows that are not quite within the compliant reasons, you will be notified. Again, I don't think I'm qualified to speak in details about how these tools work, but these tools exist. One problem, however, is I don't know how many of them are production ready, because this is also the problem that we have a lot of really good solutions coming from the academia, presented at conferences and so on. But when it comes to actually implementing the solutions, and not as just some prototype, but also as a production-ready tool, this is where we have a problem, unfortunately.
Great, thank you. And what are your recommendations for future security awareness training?
Right, it's also difficult to say, because how to implement security awareness trainings that actually work. It has been basically the topic of usable security community for how long? For 20 years now, I think. But what is important is that if you look at the practical aspect of it, then these trainings have to be cheap, ideally free. They have to be flexible in sense of that you shouldn't have to dedicate a week where developers don't do anything but visit these trainings and so on. But this is on a very practical level. But aside from this, again, these should be trainings that are ongoing. It's not just you do this training, you sit for several hours in a room and then you forget about security. It should be ongoing. It should be implemented in such a way that is really integrated into people's workflows. But it's also about communication. And as I mentioned, it's also about security culture. So it's not just you take developers, you put them in the trainings, and then they go out to trainings and then do everything else. Still, the stuff I talked about before, the responsibility of managers to provide developers with time and resources, the responsibility of establishing communication channels. So what happens if developers have questions? Do they know whom they ask, and so on? So this is all something that should be implemented on top of security trainings. But yeah, exactly recommendations how to do security trainings, it would be, I think we need another session just for that.
Yes, thank you so much. Do we have any other questions or comments on that? Currently not. Mohamed and Habiba, maybe just one last question from my side with regard to the contact tracing apps. So what do you think from our perspective as researchers, what can we do to improve the situation right now?
So I would say, to begin with, we need to establish the trust, because if the users don't trust us, if the users don't trust the app developers, they're not going to use it, no matter how efficient or how effective the idea behind is. And to establish the trust, we need to bring in data transparency between the two, how the data is being collected, processed, and used even after the crises are over. So yes, to sum up, I would say we need to foster ways to improve the trust between the developers and the users.
So I also agree with Habiba, and I also would like to emphasize what you said about, continuously working on that. So, right now, COVID that situation is much better than before. But I think we shouldn't forget about, what has happened and the problems that we encountered when using contact tracing apps. we will probably, not to be pessimistic, but let's say we may need contact tracing apps in the future to control pandemics or problems. So I think we should continue working on that topic and trying to support developers of contact tracing apps to build contact tracing apps that are privacy aware and can be trusted, so that we are able to really benefit from that in the future if we ever need it again.
Thank you for these interesting thoughts. I think trust is an important topic here. And I have also another last question to Oksana. Do you think that browser plugins might improve the situation with cookies?
Yes, I think they can. And ideally, I know that this has been also a research direction, and to develop browser plugins that, ideally as a user, I would download such a plugin. I would tell them I only want to accept cookies that are absolutely necessary for the work of the website, because I can already right now I can use my browser and say block all cookies for server, but then the website just break. So I want to accept at least some cookies, and ideally there will be such a browser that allows, and such a plugin that allows me to do this. And ideally the websites will also be compliant with such plugins, because it's also something that you really need. And whenever they get a signal that this user doesn't want to collect all but necessary cookies, then just don't. So this is something that would be helpful if such a solution would work. But again, also here you need the cooperation of, it's not enough for someone to develop the plugin and then it's done. You really need the cooperation of the website providers as well. So we also come to the question, why would they do this? And hopefully they will do the right thing eventually, but it's a process.